Now, this is an unusual Sunday too, because with the longer readings, I should probably preach a shorter sermon. And someone was saying this. There was not a very confident preacher who was going up, and he was preaching in front of a very famous teacher of preaching. And at the end of the service, he said, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, what did you think of my sermon?" And he said, he said, "As I was listening to you speak, I was just overcome with an understanding of the peace of God and also the mercy of God." And he said, "Wow," he said, "I didn't even really talk about either of those things, but I'm glad that God communicated this." And so now he's feeling a little emboldened. So he said, "If you don't mind me asking, what did I say that made you think of the peace of God and the mercy of God?" And he said, "Well, I thought of the peace of God because what you said was beyond all understanding." He said, "I thought of the mercy of God because the way you were going, I thought it would endure forever." So that won't happen today. I was actually at one of your birthday parties last night, and Fumi and I had gone to this long service for one of the Japanese people who had helped with the Japan Festival, one of the musicians who died very unexpectedly. And then I was at this birthday party, and I told them, I said, "I have to go. I have to prepare a sermon tomorrow." I said, "No, stay, have another drink." I go, "If I have another drink, I don't know what they're going to hear tomorrow." And then the guy who was standing next to the host said, "Just remember the Gettysburg Address." He said, "Just make it simple and succinct." And I said, "Well, I'm no Lincoln, and I don't know if I can do that." But I was coming home, and I thought, wow, the Gettysburg Address. And I was looking this up. I had never heard this before, because obviously that ground, those graves, that violence, that hardship, that war, that speech was sort of a compression of so much of what it meant to be American. And so as the 100th anniversary of that speech came up, the National Park Service wanted to honor it with a special dedication and another speech. So they actually reached out to John F. Kennedy, because obviously a very famous American orator. And John F. Kennedy sent his regrets. He said, "I can't give the anniversary speech because I'm going to Dallas." And it was actually 3 days later that he'd be assassinated. And they weren't going to ask LBJ because LBJ had just spoken at Memorial Day at Gettysburg. And so there was a farmer, someone who had bought a farm right next to the battlefield because he felt very close to that place, and he felt that it had a special meaning to him and for what he did with his life and for his life's work. And that was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so they asked Eisenhower if he would speak because he had moved close to the battlefield. And so he did. And I wanted to share with you just a few of his words. I didn't know about this speech till last night. I'm so glad this guy brought it up at the party. So it's very short, like you could Google this later. It's a very short speech, like Lincoln's speech. But Eisenhower said, "Where we see the serenity with which time has invested this hallowed ground, Lincoln saw the scarred earth and felt the press of personal grief. Yet he lifted his eyes to the future that is our present. He foresaw a new birth of freedom, a freedom and equality for all which under God would restore the purpose and meaning of America, defining a goal that challenges each of us to attain the full stature of citizenship. We read Lincoln's sentiments, we ponder his words. The beauty of the sentiments he expressed enthrall us. The majesty of his words hold us spellbound. But we have not paid to his message its just tribute until we ourselves live it. For well we knew that to live for the country is a duty as demanding as is the readiness to die for it. So long as this truth remains our guiding light, self-government in this nation will never die." Now he keeps going, but I don't want to just read Eisenhower's speech to you at Gettysburg on the 100th anniversary. But it's that difficult thing of standing on those graves, in those places, with the ghost of Lincoln, with those words, with Eisenhower, who had been such an important part of this war before in the 1940s. And even now as we stand with American troops almost maybe going to Iran, and we wonder, will there be another graveyard like Gettysburg? Will there be the need for more speeches like what Lincoln gave? What are we supposed to do with a world in which we live like this? And Eisenhower and Lincoln wanted us, in the face of all that violence, in the face of those graves, in the face of that possibility of almost endless war, to say, who are we and what do we hold most true about the world? And so we have to return to that space again and again to find our bearings and find our meaning in a world like ours. And that's why we have this Sunday, in case you wonder why we wave the palms and why we read the story of Jesus sort of commissioning or taking the colt that he rides into Jerusalem, why we read about his scourging, about his betrayal, about his crucifixion, about all the things and scorn that was heaped on him, is that story for us is the ground that we must return to again and again and say, what happened here and why did it happen and what does it mean for us? And if these are the truest things about what we believe in the world, calling us not just to some future where it might be, but living in the present where these things can happen, where good things can happen, and where God's mercy and light and peace can show the face of the divine. Like if you look at the story, when Pilate himself becomes almost powerless before the power of the crowd, and anyone who wields the power of death is always in danger of this, that you wield it until someone turns it on you. And then you find yourself just going, hey, you guys just go and do whatever you want. And then we get this very Roman episode of the whipping of Jesus, the scourging of Jesus. And if you've ever seen the iconography of Rome, there's a bundle of rods and there's an axe, and it's the lictor, the person that has the authority to use violence on behalf of the state. And they had various gradations of flogging, and the one that they give to Jesus is the worst. And it was legally, this was all written down in their laws. You know, the Romans were very legalistic about setting the boundaries of how they were going to abuse you. And the idea was, we need a public way to write on this person's body that they are no longer part of our community or society, but they have been degraded in their humanity to the role of a slave, property, a criminal, a pirate. All of these people, you are on the out. There is no law to protect you. There are no limits. And so much of the Roman flogging system had limits to how much they could abuse you. But when you got to where Jesus was, there were no limits. It was just the imaginative capacity, the cruelty of the person who was whipping you. And we get this inverse coronation of Jesus, which is perverse and grotesque. But it reveals something that's so true about human community. Every time someone who is human and has the dignity of a human being, who has the dignity of the face of Jesus, is able to be degraded, or the attempt is made to degrade them in their humanity, to strip away that part of them that is dignified, to say you are not protected by the law, you are not a human being, you are property. That sort of degradation of the human being, that's one of the reasons we fought the Civil War, was because we had a whole system of degradation that way, and it had to be dismantled. But here it's not dismantled, it's just preparation before Jesus is going to be taken to the place of death. This casting of people outside of the circle of protection and belonging is one of the dangers of human history that we have to reconcile ourselves to. And if you look at the long history of human torture, because there's an unending practice of human beings torturing each other, you can go all the way, fast forward from the whipping of Jesus, all the way up to something like World War II. And there was a very famous Jewish intellectual named Jean Amery, at least that was the French name he took for himself. And he was one time arrested by the secret police, and he was taken to a dungeon, and he was tortured. And he wrote a very powerful book about what it was like to be tortured, and then he went to Auschwitz after being tortured. And he said the experience of being tortured in that basement was the recognition that my humanity was being annihilated. And he said, this is beyond, he didn't use the Romans, but in this case, beyond what the Romans were doing, which was just degrading you to the lowest rung. He said, what they did to me is they were trying to push me out of the family of humanity, not to belong anywhere. And he said, I've never recovered from that because there was nothing to stop them from doing whatever they wanted. There was no power to protect me. And since that day, I felt I've been disconnected from the human family. In fact, he ended up taking his own life. Not long after that, or after he wrote those words, maybe another decade of living, because he just felt like I can never return. And some of you know that feeling. You know that feeling of if you've been degraded, if you've been humiliated, if you've been abused, if you've been kicked out of any circle of belonging, if you've been pushed outside and you're standing there like Jean Amery or like Jesus or like anyone else that the Romans did this to on the way to crucifixion, and we ask ourselves, how is it that we can participate in the world? Do we have to be the strongest? Do we have to visit violence on others so they don't visit violence on us? What do we do when we keep going back to sacred places saying, what happened here cost us a lot, like Gettysburg? And now where do we go from here? How do we maintain our deepest held values in a world that overwhelms us with with the sadness, grief, and violence of others. And Eisenhower said it wasn't just the grief of that battlefield. Lincoln felt that himself, and having lost a son to illness during the war, and a man of many sorrows. You may remember from the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus is talking about what it means to follow him closely. And he says that, if they ask you to go 1 mile, go 2. If someone says, carry my bag 1 mile, go the extra mile. And that's where we get that phrase, the extra mile. And that's what they did to Simon of Cyrene, is when they pulled this guy out of the crowd. Jesus has been so injured by the flogging that he experienced, because it's beyond any legal limit. Whoever creatively did that really tore into the flesh of Jesus, and he can't even walk the final mile to his death. And so Simon of Cyrene is called, and the Romans say, now you carry his cross for him. This is exactly when Jesus said, go the extra mile. They're using that Roman law to do that to Simon of Cyrene. And now he comes to be the unexpected disciple, which is, you have to carry this burden for Christ. You have to carry this cross for Christ. And this is the invitation to discipleship, is that each of us will be asked at a certain point to carry the suffering of others, to carry the suffering of Jesus and our neighbor, to take those people who have been degraded and say, you do not belong. You do not have any place in our society. You have no protected status in our society. There is nothing for you. Like when Jesus is whipped, and written on his body is that severing of social protection. And then they say, you help carry that person's burden. And this becomes the important moment of participating in what Amy read to us from Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2 is the earliest hymn in the history of the church. And Paul is quoting a hymn that the Philippians probably knew. And it talks about Jesus going down, Jesus descending, the condescension of love. Jesus comes and condescends to us at Christmas. Jesus condescends to us by becoming the servant, by being abused by us, by being mistreated, and all of our satire and grotesque anger visited upon him until he goes to the place of death. And he goes even farther, down to the place of the dead. Jesus goes as far from God as any human being can go and ever will go. There is no human being who's gone farther from God than Jesus. The reason being is God wanted to make sure there was no one who was exempted from the possibility of being lifted up when he went up. Because the whole point of that Christ hymn is, he went down, yes, he went down. And we heard that and we saw that today. But when he went up, he started lifting up all of this. He started lifting up every person who the Romans had flogged, who died without a name. He lifted up every person who's been crucified, and not just the people who are suffering innocently and unjustly, also the people who are unjust, the people who are criminal, the people who are reprobate, the people who are struggling with recidivism. Every person now has the possibility of being lifted up, and when Simon carries that burden for his neighbor, so too everyone who bears the name of Jesus will have the possibility of also lifting up others. So we've talked to you several times about the mother in Costa Mesa we were helping, whose son got murdered, 13-year-old son. If you don't remember that story, just Google Pico Rivera, 13-year-old murder, and you can read the horrible story of his dying. And, this was a mother that we had encountered when she was homeless, and they were all living in their car together. And that's when we came into their story. And then we got them into a hotel over on Newport Boulevard for a couple weeks. Then the school got them into a house, and then she was on her way to some self-sufficiency, and then her son got murdered. And then her mental health and her well-being, as you can imagine, her life was ruined. But it didn't mean she stopped trying to rebuild her life. And so she's rebuilding and she's going. And she called Michelle this week because Michelle has been a minister to her and caring for her. And she was talking about her mental health and what she's been going through and what she's looking forward to. And she says, I'm going to be a little behind on the rent, because she wasn't able to work because she was just crushed by this grief. And so we were talking to the lady at the school that we work with, and we said, of course, we'll help her. You will help her through the Good Sam Fund. You helped her. This is a person who's been brought very low as you can be. And now, through the ministering of staff members at the church, through the generosity of the church, she's slowly being lifted up. This is in a world where people are still being flogged and crucified, whether it's metaphorically or really, our role, being people of Easter, because always we have Easter in mind, is we are doing that work of Simon of Cyrene, taking that burden, lifting it up, and saying, this story is not over yet. The story is not over yet. And even when they go with Jesus, and he dies, and he screams, and the temple curtain is torn, and now the separation between God and the world, the danger of holiness, the the possibility of being irradiated by God's holiness, and rather than being made more alive, it just made us afraid and dead. That's all been eliminated now because of what Jesus did in his flesh. His flesh, which was torn open, becomes the pathway by which we've had this lifting up experience ourselves. And this is for every person in history who's been in a dungeon of torture, for every person in history who's been a slave, who's been degraded, who's been whipped, who's had their flesh torn, who's been told, you do not belong here, you are separated from here. Every single person is part of this tearing, which is a lifting up, an opening of graves. And you'll notice when Jesus died, it was like a bomb went off, and all of a sudden tombs were opened, and people were alive, and there was just this idea that the story is not over yet, until all the graves are open, till all the dignity is restored, until everyone that God has called is lifted up. Amen.